On August 26, 1839, two ship captains out for a day on Long Island happened upon a group of black men who had rowed a small boat ashore. Upon speaking with the men, they learned that they were seeking someone to help them sail back to Africa. These men informed the captain that there was a chest of gold and other assorted valuables on the ship that would be given to whoever would provide them with aid and rations. As the captains and the group of black men made their way back to the larger ship, they were intercepted and the ship was boarded by the United States Coast Guard. Upon boarding, the Coast Guard would learn that this ship, the Amistad, had been the site of a slave revolt and a mutiny. The Amistad had departed Havana, Cuba, for the port of Puerto Principe, where the Africans would likely be offloaded to be sold or put to work on plantations. As the ship made its voyage to the waters of Cuba, the cook, according to the testimony of one of the African captives, quote, told the captives that all their heads would be cut off and that they would be eaten. It is this, along with the dreadful idea of being forced into slavery, that led the Africans on the Amistad to revolt. Led by Sengbe Pia, also known as Chinque, the Africans killed the captain, cook, and two other Spanish citizens. Only two Spaniards were left alive, Pedro Montes and Jose Ruiz, enough for the captured Africans to be able to sail back to Africa, to their home country of Sierra Leone. During the day, the Spaniards sailed east as demanded, but at night they sought to sail northwest to the United States as their resources waned, hoping for favorable treatment and the retention of the captured Africans. Upon discovery off the shores of Long Island by the U.S. Coast Guard ship Washington, they were towed into port in Connecticut where the events of the trial began. These trials would present an opportunity for abolitionists in the North to establish a legal one and force many to examine the dynamics and nature of slavery as a system during the trial process which had, quote, rekindled the radical egalitarianism of the American Revolution. Lieutenant Gedney of the U.S. Coast Guard had brought the Amistad and its inhabitants to the port of Connecticut and sought salvage rights. Despite the port of Long Island and New York being closer, Gedney chose to tow the Amistad into Connecticut due to Connecticut's slavery laws, which at the time had not fully outlawed slavery yet like the state of New York had. So Gedney, if successful in his push for salvage rights, would see a much higher return, as the 50 or so African captives would be included in his salvage rights. Yunolu Foleon Osegi argues in her book The Amistad Revolt, Memory, Slavery, and the Politics of Identity in the United States and Sierra Leone that it is this salvage claim that pushes the judicial process into motion, as District Court Judge Andrew Judson was likely to rule in favor of Montes and Ruiz and simply release the captive Africans into their custody or the custody of the Spanish consul to return to Cuba. But Osegi argues that because Gedney demanded compensation for bringing the Amistad into port, the judicial process was opened up for further and closer examination of all the circumstances surrounding the Amistad. As the Circuit Court of Connecticut made preparations for the trial of the Amistad captives, the ordeal and plight of the Africans on board became of great interest to the public. News publications had previously, in the month or so leading up to the arraignment of the Amistad and the subsequent trial, spread the story of the errant path of the Amistad as it made its way along the New England seaboard. These news articles fueled rumors all over New England of a pirate ship that, quote, had been acting strangely off the coast, had started all kinds of rumors which spread terrorism in the seaport towns. When it was announced that the mysterious ship had been captured, the interest, curiosities, and fears of the people of New England stoked high amounts of interest in the subsequent case. The abolition movement had been gaining steam in the northern states for a while, and upon hearing of the case of the Amistad Africans, a group of abolitionists formed the Amistad Commission, who would be tasked in finding interpreters and mounting a legal defense for the Africans. The committee members also saw it fit to provide the Africans with education in English and Christianity. It is this education that Vincent Carretta and Marcus Rediker point to as enabling them to seem, quote, less alien to whites and to recreate themselves as a new cultural and political entity, the Mendi people. During the trial surrounding the Amistad, there were a number of claims and charges that needed to be investigated, understood, and ruled upon. Firstly, Theodore Sedgwick Jr., on behalf of the Amistad captives, had filed for a writ of habeas corpus, arguing that some of the Africans, particularly the children, had been held unfairly by the courts with no fair charge against them. Secondly, the United States had issued warrants for the Amistad captives for murder and piracy. And lastly, the claims for salvage and property rights of Gedney and Montes, and a claim from the United States District Attorney that the Spanish embassy had requested that the Amistad and the remaining captives be released to the Crown of Spain for trial and likely for execution in Cuba. As the trial began, Roger Baldwin, a New Haven lawyer, would be instrumental in the defense of the captive Africans. Baldwin, via the similar testimony of multiple members of the Amistad group, obtained via interpreter, reasoned that the Africans had not been born in Cuba, but rather been kidnapped from the Mendi region of Sierra Leone, and that their records had been fudged to make their importation to Cuba seem legal. Baldwin points to the fact that the youngest of the Amistad captives spoke no Spanish, and if in fact they had been born in Cuba, it is likely that they would speak the local language at a basic level. Baldwin and others also argued that despite slavery still being fully legal in Cuba, that the court was under an obligation and commitment to ignore that and rely on the principles of American law, arguing, quote, "Is the law of Cuba to be enforced here? Are the courts of the United States required to prefer this law to their own for the purpose of reducing these children to slavery?" Baldwin also argues that per an 1817 treaty, Spain, along with other European powers, had sought to put an end to the slave trade and declared everyone involved in it to be, quote, "felonious and piratical." Baldwin then attacks Lieutenant Gedney's salvage claim and the claim that he had performed a meritorious service. He questions the nature of the act, asking if, quote, "aiding a foreign slave dealer and reducing again to slavery those whom they have kidnapped is truly a meritorious service." In the final decision in the circuit court, the nature of the freedom of the captives was not finally decided, but they were allowed to be released if bail was posted. But it was decided that the court has no jurisdiction to try the captives for a crime that allegedly occurred on a Spanish vessel in Cuban waters regarding Spanish citizens. The ruling, while not a guarantee of freedom for the Africans, had been viewed as a win for abolitionists who continued to work with the captives, fundraising for them to be able to eventually return to Africa, and establishing the de facto leader of the revolt, Jinque, as a public figure to attempt to appeal to the humanity of Africans and the broader black population still in slavery in the United States. Continued media coverage in New England in the aftermath of the case remained, quote, "largely favorable to the potential slaves, even though they had washed up on shore with the blood of white men on their hands." These continued efforts from abolitionists in the North would prove somewhat inconsequential in large-scale consideration of the plight of black people in slavery in the U.S., but on a smaller scale, the efforts of the Amistad Commission and other abolitionists brought more eyes to the case of the captive Africans than would have been interested otherwise. Following the ruling in the circuit court, the U.S. District Attorney, on behalf of the Spanish consul and the Van Buren administration, elected to file for an appeal in the Supreme Court. From the start, the Van Buren administration had sought to get in the way of the judicial process, with the administration's position being, quote, "that the Africans should be handed over to Spain as quickly as possible and without the judiciary's involvement." And with each subsequent ruling in favor of the Amistad captives, the Van Buren administration would appeal the rulings until the case eventually reached the Supreme Court. Patricia Roberts Miller, in her analysis of John Quincy Adams' rhetoric in his Supreme Court defense in the Amistad case, argues that the Van Buren admin was likely informed by his upcoming re-election campaign, not wanting to alienate fellow Democrats in the South, seeing that the case had major implications, and that, quote, "Van Buren could not be seen as doing anything hostile to slavery. He could not let abolitionists win the Amistad case." In the Supreme Court case, the Amistad captives would be represented by former President John Quincy Adams. In his argument, Adams not only reasserts the illegality of the actions of Montes and Ruiz in shipping the Africans across the Atlantic, directly in violation of the treaty with Spain ratified in 1817, but he also expands on the Africans as being entitled to the universal rights that the United States claims to be built upon. Adams states in his defense, "I know of no law but one, which I am not at liberty to argue before this court, no law, statute, or constitution, no code, no treaty, applicable to the proceedings of the executive or the judiciary, except that law," pointing to a copy of the Declaration of Independence. "That law, 2 copies of which are ever before the eyes of your honors. I know of no other law that reaches the case of my clients, but the law of nature and of nature's God, on which our fathers placed our own national existence." Adams also takes an aggressive stance in attacking the actions of the Van Buren administration that, quote, "instead of that justice which they were bound no less than this honorable court itself to observe, they have substituted sympathy with one of the parties in this conflict of justice." Adams argues that the Van Buren administration has allowed itself to be partial in the processes of justice and allowed itself to be manipulated by the interests of a foreign power in favor of the wishes of foreign citizens over the universal right to freedom that he saw written in the Declaration of Independence. After hearing the appeals and the new defenses from Adams, Justice Joseph Story would deliver the opinion of the court that the Amistad captives were, quote, natives of Africa and were kidnapped there and were unlawfully transported to Cuba in violations of laws and treaties of Spain, and that the Africans were, quote, entitled to their freedom. Justice Story also revises the ruling of the district court, decreeing that the African captives were not to be delivered to the custody of the president, but were to be free, completely and with no strings or obligations to the legal mechanisms of the United States. The case of the Amistad brings up a lot of interesting points for consideration when investigating the legal processes of the United States, as well as providing an interesting look at the dynamics of slave revolts, abolition, and the institution of slavery in antebellum America. Vincent Coretta notes that, quote, rare are the known cases of slave ship insurrections, rarer still were the successful ones, and rarest of all is one as fully documented as that on the Amistad. So examining it allows unique insight into the dynamics of violent resistance to slavery. The violent nature of the slave revolt aboard the Amistad challenged the tactics of nonviolence held by many white abolitionists at the time, forcing them to reckon with the effectiveness of violence and the sympathy that those accused of murder to avoid slavery received. Teresa Varadrenin notes this as well when she points out that, quote, accomplished what no amount of good behavior or nonviolence could have, he had forced Americans to examine the Africans' humanity. Patricia Roberts Miller points out that, quote, neither the United States nor Spain was consistently treating the Africans as property, but instead identifying them as subject to the laws regarding property and the laws regarding persons. The nature of the treatment of the captive Africans emphasizes Roberts Miller's assertion that slavery is a, quote, notoriously schizophrenic institution. In the circuit court arguments, Roger Baldwin points out that, quote, it is only when men come here with black skin that we look upon them in a condition in which they may be any means made slaves. So it is plainly evident that abolitionists at the time were also coming to realize the hypocrisy inherent to slavery. The actions of the Amistad captives and the nature and arguments within the legal cases, the actions of the Spanish and United States governments, all demonstrate unique facets and positions on more than just the case, but on slavery as a whole, and as have been examined here, paint a comprehensive picture of the dynamics of abolition in the northern United States as they begin to take hold in the minds of the greater population of the nation and of the world.